So I think I will get started. Thank you for calling in and zooming in to hear our presentation today. This is our last data analysis presentation um, eh, as part of a project. So we're sort of at the midway point. Um, just admitting one additional person here. We're sort of at the midway point or the halfway point of this project, which is designed to develop conservation plans for Long Island Sound marsh complexes in New York. Um, I'm Jonathan Clow with Warren Pinnacle Consulting, and this project is done with EPA funding in partnership with the Department of Environmental Conservation and the Long Island Sound Study, and getting funding through NEIWPCC. So as a necessary disclaimer, this money for this funding this project does originally come from EPA funding, but it hasn't undergone EPA peer review, and so therefore the any conclusions or data that is not um, endorsed by EPA, Long Island Study, or NEWIPIC. So we'll start out with introduction from our project team. There are three of us that are forming the core of this project. I'll start with um, Vicky. If I haven't heard from you yet, but I think I saw you're on the phone. You might be muted. We'll get back to Vicky if we hear her chime in a little bit later. But she's our with I'll let Marco go next. Marco, are you back?
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah. Yeah. Good morning. I am Marco Propato. I'm a research associate at Warren Pinnacle Consulting, and I've been working with SLAM models since 2011, and I've participated to this project, running all the simulations and analysis.
And as I said, I'm Jonathan Clow with Warren Pinnacle Consulting. We are really a micro consulting firm based out of central Vermont. And we've been doing marsh modeling since the late 1990s. But I've been an environmental consultant with predominantly EPA clients since 1995. Vicky, I don't know whether are you on, is your audio working yet? Vicky is our partner with Long Island Sound Study, with NEWIPIC, and with NISDEC, um, giving us a lot of support in this project. So what we're going to try to do this morning is give you an overview of what's going on with this project. We're going to start out with some brief introductions, which we've already started that. And we're going to basically give an overview of the project, and we're going to try to go back and forth between hands-on training and project overview. And we're hoping that we can, as we go through some of these training exercises, that people will be willing to chime in with their thoughts, their suggestions, their impressions. And so we're hoping that this can be a working meeting in which is not only one way. This is one of our smallest meetings that we've had, and so hopefully that means that people will be willing to communicate. So to that end, let's see, I was hoping that we could do some people could be willing to introduce themselves. So we already went through Jonathan and Marco. Or if you don't have a microphone, or you're having trouble, or you'd rather not be recorded, you could feel free to, as Vicky's having trouble with unmuting. I don't think that I have. I don't think I have the capability to unmute you directly, Vicky. So anyway, that's fine. You can communicate via the chat for the time being, and other people can introduce themselves via the chat as well. But I don't know if people are willing to introduce themselves. Sometimes with Zoom, it's hard to know who goes first, so that's why I put this participants list up here. So I don't know if George, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us just a minute about sort of your relation to marsh conservation? in Suffolk County. What about Josh? Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Josh Halsey. I work at the Peconic Land Trust. We do work with a number of different partners on the South Shore and the North Shore. So just looking, for ways to integrate more tools into our projects.
Thank you. Stephen?
Hi, I'm Steve Kleiss. I'm with the Town of North Hempstead Waterfront Advisory Committee, just as a guest to stay up to date on what's going on with these kinds of ecological approaches.
Thank you. Got a couple of phone, but I think one of those might be Heather on the phone, perhaps.
Hi, I'm Heather. I'm the land acquisition person for DEC on Long Island.
Thank you. And then we just had a couple of other people join in. Ilya, would you want to introduce yourself and to our small group? No pressure here. You can always just if you'd like to introduce yourself. Oh, and your microphone's not working, or for some reason, you can always enter in the chat. So I think I'm going to leave it like that, unless I missed anybody who came in late. Feel free to chime in and introduce yourself. All right.
Hey, Jonathan, it's Vicki. Now I can talk, right?
Hi, Vicki.
Yes.
I don't know if I gave you an adequate introduction, but you're welcome to introduce yourself more if you would like at this point.
Yeah, no, I'm Vicki O'Neill. I'm the Long Island Sound Study Habitat Restoration and Stewardship Coordinator at New York State DEC. I work for NEIWPCC, and I know many of you. And my issue was I forgot to press *6 when I entered the meeting on my phone, so that's why I was not unmuted. I had to unmute myself by pressing *6. If that's anyone else's problem.
Thank you. That's helpful. This project came together in an effort to, again, sort of the development of marsh conservation plans. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. That's sort of a flexible term. It can mean a lot of different things to different people. And we're not necessarily attached to a single definition on that either, but really to try to bring different groups together, government groups, non-governmental organizations, different size government, state and local municipalities, in terms of working together and thinking about what marshes provide, what risks that they face, especially from sea level rise, because that's where our data comes from so far. But then, and then what might be done collaboratively to conserve those. And as part of this project, we're leveraging some work that we've done over the last 6 or 7 years, funded by NYSERDA, which looks at the potential impacts of sea level rise on marshes and which marshes are more vulnerable than others. And what that's done is produced, hundreds of gigabytes of GIS data, which can be a little overwhelming. And so what we wanted to do was kind of call out the most important results from that and put that in an online viewer that's really sort of lightweight and simple. And then also cross-references those results with some new data sets, which are just land ownership data sort of on a tax parcel layer. And so right now we're at this second red bullet here where we're going to be presenting that viewer and the results of our data analysis so far. And then unfortunately, the second half of this project has a little bit of an accelerated schedule. We've had some data acquisition delays. We had some COVID delays, and we were actually sort of pausing because we were hoping to do a lot of these meetings in person, but obviously doing it over Zoom is sort of the current status of these things. And so, through January of 2021, we would like to work with municipalities and provide support to these conservation stakeholder groups in putting together some marsh conservation plans, and then through the next couple of months, take these conservation plans out to community and get some community feedback and incorporate those. We started out with a process of site selection, which basically what we tried to do in this case was find all of the large sort of contiguous marsh parcels that are within the Long Island Sound, the New York Long Island Sound region, which was and that was sort of on the basis of who's funding this work in terms of the Long Island Sound study. And then also to define their geographic area and come up with sort of named marsh systems, marsh parcels that might be subject to a marsh conservation plan, that you might have groups be willing to plan around. So in terms of looking at Suffolk County, we're going to be kind of focusing primarily on these parcels 15 through 20, going from West Meadow Creek to Mattatuck River. Now, the other thing to point out is that we do actually have the SLAM model results for the entirety of coastal New York and also coastal Connecticut that could be leveraged for different projects so this we focused on this area here, but we have the capability of expansion to other areas as well, not necessarily through this project, but the extension of this may not be too intense. Quickly to go through the basis of the modeling that we're looking at here. One of the primary threats that marshes in the United States are facing over the next 80 years and beyond potentially is increase in sea level rise. And what we've seen from the historical record is that marshes do have a horizontal move under the presence of sea level rise. And there's also an impact on the depth of the sediment or on sedimentation or the topography of the land on the basis of sea level rise as you have more sedimentation occurring as places get flooded more frequently. And so what our model is basically doing is looking at that under future sea level and extrapolating that type of movement. But there are a number of issues that prevent that from occurring. You could have some steep terrain. So as you raise your sea level in this case, that there would be a very limited area where marshes would have the right degree of flooding. So this you could lose marsh that way, a marsh squeeze. And then especially, this is significant for Long Island and New York, just that there will be land development, or there might be areas where these are upland where there'll be future seawall building or current seawall building to prevent that marshes from moving. So that's another potential way that these could be squeezed. And so our model takes into account these to the best of our ability based on the data that we have. But there is something else that adds a little bit of complexity to the simple underlying model. And that is the fact that there are some dynamics that occur, especially within marshes as sea levels rise. The marshes tend to start to grow more rapidly, put more energy into their shoots rather than their roots. So they grow taller. As part of that, they're getting flooded more frequently, and they start to trap more inorganic sediment. So you have this combination of organic production, inorganic sediment trapping, and you end up with an elevation gain via surface accretion. There also can be some potential issues in terms of changes in salinity in the soil and some shallow compaction as well. So our model tries to take into account all of these, some of them more mechanistically, some of them more empirically, but these relationships between sea level and elevation surface under the marsh. And the tool that we have used in this analysis and that we are leveraging the results from is called SLAM. It's the sea level affecting marshes model. And so again, it starts with it was developed in the mid 1980s with this really simple conceptual model, although it always incorporated this possibility of marsh elevation change due to this accretion process, the the collection of inorganic sediment. But that's gotten more complex, as we will discuss. But it used to run on a very large cell size, and now we're down to 5-meter cell size. It is ultimately a landscape model, however, and it was designed by EPA to help them with um, marsh conservation policy under sea level rise. And so because of that, its outputs are specifically what policymakers need. But it is a simple model. It's not a hydrodynamic model. It doesn't have a lot of complexity with regards to how coastal landscape will change. But it has a lot of federal users through the years. EPA obviously developed it and has used it intermittently. Worked on projects with the USGS, Fish and Wildlife Service has been a big supporter, as well as non-governmental organizations such as the Nature Conservancy, National Wildlife Federation, and then it's also a lot of local governments have used it as evidenced by these NYSERDA results. Our work with NYSDEC here, New York City Parks, a lot of local users as well. So the basis of the model is, again, sort of a simple relationship between the frequency at which a land is flooded and the type of wetland that occurs there. So you have a sort of if you look at this as a coastal service, and this is the tide range here between mean low water and mean high water. And then about monthly, you have more irregular flooding due to wind tides, due to lunar tide differences, or storms, or any of those pieces. So up in this upper area, generally above mean high water, you have an irregularly flooded marsh. So an area where there's enough coastal flooding that you have salinity and that you're going to have a brackish marsh be the dominant species, or maybe a transitional shrub type of habitat. Above that, you have dry land or freshwater wetlands. And then down within the tidal frame itself, between mean low and mean high water, you would have a regularly flooded marsh, which would be sort of an emergent marsh. And they offer different ecosystem services. And they have different salinities generally, different species in those locations. So it's not a species level model, but it's kind of looking at where these habitats potentially are. And then often below mean tide level, there really isn't any emergent. I mean, generally we find that there's not emergent vegetation below mean tide level, other than submerged aquatic vegetation. So if you take this and you add sea level rise, you just have this horizontal movement, and SLAM will produce these two-dimensional maps showing where marshes potentially could migrate or would migrate under sea level rise, also taking into account the fact that there are impacts and that these land elevations are not constant. They're moving up or down. So some of the complexities that are included in this include examination of hydraulic connectivity, so where the water can or can't get to due to roads, culverts, etc. We do look at the impact of changing salinity and the fact that might have marsh collapse. Again, in terms of the hydraulic connectivity, that takes into account dikes, levees, and infrastructure. We'll talk more about how we model marsh accretion and the feedbacks to that. But also, because it is a landscape model that can run pretty quickly, we can run uncertainty analysis. And a lot of what we're going to be looking at are models where we've run it hundreds of times and looked at the uncertainty in different parameters and how that affects model outputs. One of the refinements that we've put in place for SLAM over the last decade has been the fact that accretion rates, so that's the motion, and we're using accretion here sort of generally to talk about elevation change under marsh flooding, but they can be a function of how frequent of where the marsh is in the tidal frame. So in this graph here, we're looking at the elevation of a potential marsh surface. And what Jim Morris found with his data and his models is that there's kind of a parabolic response in terms of how rapidly the marsh is changing in elevation based on where it is in the tidal frame. So if it gets up too high, it's not getting flooded at all, and the accretion rate is close to zero. If it gets down too low, it starts to be an eroding edge in an unstable zone. But there is a sweet spot in the middle where it's getting flooded, and it's also growing sort of at its optimal speed. So you're getting both organic and inorganic production there. And so this is where the feedback comes into place. If you have a marsh that's really perched up high, as it starts to flood, it would be subject to higher accretion rates. So at this point, I would definitely listen to any questions anybody had, either through the microphone or through the chat box. And then I'm going to start to talk a little bit about the viewer that we have for these marsh results that show results for Long Island Sound. So the interactive FATE viewer is built on an open source platform called Leaflet. You can find it at this URL here, which is warrenpinnacle.com LI maps. And you should have this URL in the training materials that we sent, and also in any of the emails that we sent you about this. So at any point, you can go ahead and navigate to that. We're going to be doing some hands-on exercise with that shortly, and I'm going to run through some of the main points of the interface right now. I wanted to start out by talking about the SLAM land cover categories, because there are 26 of these, and these have grown over time as we have applied the model to more and more areas, including, the Florida Keys and Alaska and the Gulf. And so there are some categories here that are very important to some areas, like say a cypress swamp or a permanently flooded cypress swamp or a mangrove, that really are not relevant. And so as well as, 4 or 5 different types of open water. So to simplify the results, we have split these down into these 6 categories. The first thing we did was we got rid of all open water, and we showed that as transparent. And we showed all upland, non-wetlands that are uplands, some dry lands. We showed those as transparent so that you can see through and get some context of where these marshes are. Then sort of moving up the tidal frame, you start with this area where the land is predicted to be below mean tide level. So you have a non-vegetated low tidal. This would be a beach or a tidal flat. The low marsh, which I defined before as something that gets flooded daily and has higher salinity, would be this sort of lime green color. Then you have a blue color, which would be the high marsh. And then there's we are doing some characterization of the freshwater wetlands. We just call that freshwater non-tidal. Every now and then you rarely might find a freshwater tidal habitat, which is called out just because of its rareness and also its ecological significance. And then we also look at areas where there could potentially be a marsh habitat, but currently there is impervious surfaces covering them, and we call that flooded developed. And that is this purple color. So that's the context in terms of what you're going to see for land cover. And then in terms of sea level rise, we look at a range of sea level rise based on the 2016 New York Governor's Office. So we look at low, medium, and high, and that range is from 400 millimeters or 0.4 meters, which is just slightly higher than the historic. The medium is almost up to 1 meter. So just about 3 feet of sea level rise. And then the high is almost up to 2 meters, which is largely considered to be as high as sea level rise could potentially get by the year 2100 due to limits in the dynamics of ice sheet melting. So that's kind of your getting close to your worst case scenario. And when we look at uncertainty analysis, for for this project and previous projects, we looked at a number of different papers and came up with this triangular distribution, which represents what we think the most likely range of sea level rise would be. So this on the x-axis here are sea level rise in meters. And so the thought is that something around a little over 1 meter is the most likely. So if you were to do hundreds of uncertainty analysis draws and build a histogram and sort of build columns higher based on where you're drawing from, you most often be right at 1 meter. But we felt like the range of uncertainty would range between 0.35 and 2.35 meters. And this was, we examined the 2016 governor's report also had some probabilistic analysis in there. And so we looked at that upper confidence interval, their 95th percent confidence interval, and the 95th percent confidence interval of this distribution, and they are quite consistent. So on the other hand, if you look at the low, medium, and high scenarios that we're looking at, in our probabilistic analysis, we assigned the low sea level rise scenario pretty low likelihood based on our professional judgment and the literature analysis that we did. The medium analysis is slightly below what we think is most likely, and the high scenario is not exactly a worst case, but getting towards that worst case scenario. So our uncertainty analysis our uncertainty analysis runs actually are assume a little bit more sea level rise than you might assume looking at the combination of the low, medium, and high scenarios. And this is just a different way to look at that same distribution with a cumulative distribution function. In this case, you can just see that about half of the runs are going to be under 1 meter, half of the runs are going to be over 1 meter, and the range is from about 0.4 to a little bit to just over 2.2. But the number of samples in this range, the number of uncertainty analysis runs will be very low. Okay, so I don't know if there's any questions about definition of land cover or uncertainty, but I'm going to jump into the viewer now and show some of its capabilities. Just find my right notes page here. So the first thing that you come up with when you bring up this is this required disclaimer, and just click on that message to make it disappear, and you can see that we have the study area demarcated in these red areas. If you hover over these red polygons, you'll get a list of all the different marshes that we're looking at: Mattatuck River, Baiting Hollow, Wading River, and you can zoom in by clicking on the mouse, and you can scroll very easily by clicking and dragging. You can also zoom in using this plus and minus button on the upper left. You can also usually use your mouse scroll bar to zoom in and out. And also, if you want to go to a particular location, you can click on the Zoom to menu at the top, which shows you all of the 20 sites that we're looking at. And when you zoom in close enough to one of these sites, let me go to Mattatuck Creek. Then it changes, and you no longer have that red polygon, but you have this combination of tax parcels and probabilistic model results as a default. But there are a number of different things you can look at. But before I get into the exact definitions of what these all mean, I still want to spend a little bit more time on the left here of the interface, showing the fact that, I mean, this is pretty straightforward. This is the legend, which as you're starting to use the model, I think will be pretty useful. It explains to you exactly what you're looking at, but you can hide it as you start to not need that information, or if you wanted to do a screen capture of some sort. And you can just click legend again to get it back. So in this legend panel, also you have some capability to click to help file here at the bottom, which gives you information about how to use the whole interface. So if there's any questions about what the interface means, you can start there, as well as links to our emails, so you can communicate with us if you have any questions. So we encourage you to reach out if anything is confusing to you. And some other capabilities. Sometimes, in this case, sometimes having the black and this shows that these tax boundaries are have color have color coding to them. So the blue parcels that you're looking at here are public lands, and the black parcels are private lands. But sometimes, if you are also that can get in the way of your interpretation of what you're looking at. So you can click on this no colors button just to get everything uniformly black, or restore colors to get back to the black and blue color. And then the other thing that you can see over here to the left is there's a capability for each of the sites to click through to a fact sheet. I'm going to talk about the fact sheet in just a moment. Now, also, what's going on here in the legend is a function of these options that you've chosen in the upper right. So first of all, there are a number of different base maps that you can look at. Right now, we're looking at a topo map. Imagery is a very useful one that we'll use a lot, which brings up a satellite image, and you can come in, close and get a sense of what's going on in each of these parcels. There is a black and white option, which can be useful for looking at colored data on top of it. It's a pretty simple result, but it can give you some context while still giving you the capability to interpret these colors more precisely, potentially, or have the colors really pop. Then you have the capability to turn on or off the tax boundaries, because sometimes you just want to get a sense of what's going on for the site as a whole before you bring up the tax boundaries. Then below that, you have the 3 base model results maps. So you have, right now we're at no overlay and no tax parcels. So basically we're just have a interface to look at satellite imagery, which is interesting sometimes. But if you want to get a look at what the model's predicting in terms of marsh type, you can click on this marsh type button. And I'm going to go ahead and just start with black and white so we can get these colors to pop a little bit. When you bring up the marsh type, you can see you have the legend changes over here, and you also have some bars down here you can look at. And the first one on the bottom is the date of the model simulation. So you can use your mouse to scroll back and forth and kind of get an animation of what things might look like at this marsh over the next 100 years, or 90. Or really 80, I suppose. But the base year 2010, sometimes I'll refer to that as the current condition, even though maybe 2025 is closer. But the base year is based on National Wetland Inventory data. And so this gives you a sense of what's going on at this site in the current condition. We also run the model for something that we call time zero and calibrate the model to that, just to get us. So this is sort of mostly National Wetland Inventory data with a little bit of model results added in there. Just sometimes that gives you some more information, because the National Wetland Inventory data is fairly coarse, and the LiDAR data is fine. So sometimes there's some additional features cut into that. And above the date is the low, medium, and high sea level rise. And we already covered what that meant, but there's a reminder here of what that means in the legend, in case you want to go back and refer to that. So if you look at the year 2010 and you go back and forth between low, medium, and high sea level rise, because this is the base condition, sea level rise is not really relevant. We haven't started applying sea level rise to this. But if we start with a low sea level rise, I would say a best case scenario, and then you go ahead and you scroll through these years, you can start to see that there is some dynamics even under a low sea level rise of what's going on. So we can see actually a lot of the existing marsh, and again, so this green marsh would be a low marsh, so marsh that's relatively low in elevation. The blue marsh is a higher marsh, but a lot of the existing marsh, as we saw, because it's subject to accretion, you're not losing a lot of existing marsh, because that marsh is expected to move kind of in equilibrium with this low sea level rise. But you do have some areas of potential existing additional marsh, and some developed land going on. So sometimes an interesting to do, you go back to the imagery and see what it is that we're looking at in that area of potential flooding. And I don't know exactly what that infrastructure is, but you can take a look and see that there is some potential for marsh inhabitation or flooded developed land. And I think if you turn on the tax boundaries, you can click on that. It's owned by the state of New York, so it's not information about exactly what it is, but that's okay. So that's the low sea level rise scenario. I'm going to zoom back out and get more of a macro view of this site. Turn off the tax boundaries again so we can get a sense of what's going on. And I guess I'll go back to black and white just because some of these blue against the green of the background. So if you look at a medium sea level rise, you can do this animation in this bar, and you start to see some changes in the marshes that are predicted. You've got a lot of this blue color turning green, meaning that you have some of this high marsh with lower salinity becoming low, more regularly flooded marsh with higher salinity. That can have impacts on the ecological services that are provided by that marsh, as well as it's a habitat transition. And so, that might need to be managed to make sure that we're not having excessive erosion or something going on, that there is a viable marsh surface being maintained there, and potential for additional flooding down here. Under a high sea level rise, a lot of this marsh, even though it's high in the tidal frame to begin with, is subject to be lost. So you have a lot of open water that's occurring up here. Now, in terms of using these, let us know if you have any issues with this viewer. We'll be very interested in getting any technical feedback. But we have tested it on a lot of different browsers. I'm running it right now in Chrome, and that's where I found it kind of works best for animation. It does a better job of caching the data and enabling you to go back and forth. Most of the browsers, if you select something like this, you can use the keyboard. Right now, I'm just using the arrow keys to move it back and forth, and that's true for all of these sliders. It can be useful sometimes to go back and forth between marsh and no overlay or probability maps. So the probability maps take into account that you don't need, all of a sudden your sea level rise slider is gone, because we're taking into account the uncertainty of sea level rise in these probability runs. So these are composed of hundreds of runs where we sample different sea level rise, but also, as Marco will discuss, we sample different accretion rates, we sample different erosion rates. So we try to take all of the uncertain parameters and vary them within their range of uncertainty simultaneously to get a sense of overall model parametric uncertainty, the impact that the model parameters have on the uncertainty of the model results. And so what we're looking at here in the current condition is the currently existing areas of marsh have very high likelihood of persistence. Now, there are some blue fringes, even in the current condition, the uncertainty analysis, because we're varying the tide range. So we have some uncertainty. We don't have a gauge right at this location. And there's a small chance that you're getting enough nuisance flooding for there to be potential marsh habitat. I guess probably about a 1% chance for there to be enough. I don't think it's actually occurring, but it could be occurring. And so that's what's reflected here. But really, we'll look at these red areas and what they look like. Let's first look at the existing marsh and what that might look like as we go through to the year 2100. And you can see that they start to become, some of them have very low likelihood of continuing to have marsh. So these blue areas, and then some of them sort of become purplish. So this is saying, oh, okay, well, it looks like it's about 40 to 50% chance that this marsh is going to persist in the future based on all the uncertainty that we have. So it is potentially at risk. At the same time, you have areas which are not currently marsh, which have a high likelihood of, and in this case, this red color here says it's a high likelihood of being in the elevational niche, which would support a marsh. And so what this is not taking into account is, if you go back to marsh type, you can see there's a lot of developed land there. So it's not taking into account, the potential of seawalls being developed and, in order to protect that development. So there's a lot of things that aren't being taken into account. So really in the probabilistic result, it's giving you sort of your best case scenario. All right, so I think that brings us to the fact sheets. So if you click on the fact sheet button, you bring up this 4-page document for each site. The first 2 pages provide some project background, are the same for each of the complexes. Then you get to some specific information about whichever site that you are looking at. In this case, Mattatuck Creek, there's some overview. So under several marsh scenarios, the current marsh is predicted to keep up with sea level rise. But then it talks a little bit about some of the other. Then there are a number of graphics, which I'll talk about momentarily. But then to the right here, on the second page, and I'm on the 4th page in the upper right, there is a table which shows what the expected outcome is for existing marsh. So you can see and it breaks it down into public and private land. So there's 74 acres of current marsh. And in terms of the existing marsh on public land, it looks like by 2055, about 10% of that is vulnerable to sea level rise alone. So we're not taking into account like the combination of sea level rise and other factors, which would be development encroachment or nutrient issues which cause marsh loss, boat traffic, whatever it might be. By 2100, about half of it is predicted to be vulnerable to sea level rise, and the expected result is to actually lose half of it by 2100, given this uncertainty analysis. However, on the other hand, there's a lot of potential for expansion in this zone, where you can have new marsh areas. In public land, you could have 28 acres if it's managed for marsh expansion, and marsh is allowed to expand into the habitat. And in private land, there's a whopping 56. So the total potential marsh habitat has the potential to go up under sea level rise, but it's really a function of what's going to happen in this undeveloped dry land, public and private, how that's going to be managed, whether marshes are going to be allowed to persist, whether they're actually going to be, restoration work or work to ensure that conditions are working for marsh habitat. So that is an overview of the fact sheet, and you're going to get different results. Some of these areas are much more vulnerable and less vulnerable. And so we're hoping that by looking at these fact sheets comparatively, you get an overview of each site in terms of its vulnerability to sea level rise, especially. And so the graphics that are on the fact sheets include results. We've seen the current marsh results in the viewer. And we've seen the probability of marsh habitat in the year 2100, but there is an additional map in the fact sheet that's not in the viewer, which is breaking out the probabilistic maps by whether there's development there or not. So, so like, for example, in the lower right here, we're looking at areas that are developed that would potentially have marsh habitat. And that's important for 2 reasons. First of all, it gives you a sense of what infrastructure is subject to frequent nuisance flooding, once per month nuisance flooding, which is a lot. And it also gives you a sense of where you might have to restore, remove barriers to marsh expansion. Like if there's a road that's in the way, like if that road's lifted up, then you have to think about the marsh that is potentially behind it, or developed areas that could potentially be restored for marsh habitat. I think I covered the fact sheet tables quickly, but again, it gives you an accounting of existing marsh broken down by public and private, new marsh areas that are undeveloped, and new marsh areas that are developed, both in public and private areas. And again, these results are based on the probabilistic results. So it doesn't incorporate sea level rise, but it gives you the expected value result. And the expected value result is taking all of the uncertainty analysis runs, taking that outcome, and then multiplying it by the likelihood that that uncertainty analysis would happen. So like if you ran 100 times and you thought each had an equal likelihood, then you would multiply that result by 100 and you get the expected value. So in a way, hopefully that simplifies things because you don't have to consider, we don't have to have 5 of these tables, one for each sea level rise. On the other hand, if that's something that would be useful, we do have those data available. Okay, at this point, I would again open up the open up to questions, and I'm glad to hear that the viewer worked on a Mac, because that's one of the platforms we didn't test.
This is Steve Kleiss. I do have a question. This is an excellent presentation, lots of good information. What is the impact of nitrogen load on the development of marshes? Because Suffolk County and other counties are looking for ways to reduce a nitrogen introduction. It's just curious to know what the impact has been of increased nitrogen load and what it will be if we're successful in reducing it.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that's an interesting question, and it gets to the fact that we are looking at, in New York, Connecticut, Southern New York, we're looking at a situation where there's been quite a bit of marsh loss historically. But if we were to run this model on the historic marshes, marsh data, we wouldn't necessarily predict that marsh loss on the basis of sea level rise alone, because the sea level rise historically has been lower or at equilibrium with the measured accretion rates for the marshes. So as these marshes are going through this accretion process of gathering sediment, they do to a certain extent potentially become a little bit more vulnerable as well, because this necessity to move upward, the changes in salinity, the putting a little less energy and more energy into the shoots rather than the roots. So there is a potential that just keeping up has a cost. But I think one of the theories that we've seen in terms of the existing marsh loss is that a lot of that has been driven by nutrient, excessive nutrients in a lot of cases. For example, looking at, there's been a lot of loss on on Jamaica Bay, on the Marsh Islands there. And so, we looked at, our model predictions as sort of a hindcast at historical, and we thought we wouldn't have been predicting that based on sea level rise alone again. And so looking at those, at some papers that were put together, the scientific theory there was that there could be some impact of boat traffic, but that there's a combination of organic matter and nutrients that essentially overload when you have the nutrients added to the marsh surface. Again, that promotes sort of shoot growth, and the roots become sort of less important in terms of the marshes maybe getting more of their nutrients from the water surface as opposed to from the roots, is the theory. And therefore, those marsh areas become potentially much more subject to erosion because they're not building those roots. Marco, I don't know if you have anything to add on that. I know you've read a little bit more of those papers than I did, and I'm wondering if I'm summarizing it correctly in your opinion.
Yeah. Basically, what the general thought is that having these loads, these excessive nutrients, basically, they have, as you were saying, more shoots. And so what happens is that the root system is not as resistant or, as solid. And so then you actually end up having marsh losses because they cannot keep up with maybe boating and other events that are more natural but not strictly related to sea level rise. And so you get a loss just because of that.
Yeah, and I think that raises, thank you for that question. I think it raises the point that these model results that we're looking at are based on sea level rise alone. And so they are optimistic. And so they would assume there isn't additional marsh loss based on things like nutrient impacts. And one of the things that we did with the NEIWPCC results was also look at additional potential of marsh loss. If you took the current rate of marsh loss, assumed that was not due to sea level rise, and added that on top of the sea level rise. So that is another sort of analysis that we could look at, and then you could make the case that in order to have these sort of rosy scenarios, even though they're not all rosy, but in some cases they are, they show a fair degree of resilience. In order to have that, then you would need to manage the nutrient loads. So thank you for the question. Okay, so the next thing that we have here is just to do a quick hands-on exercise. Now, if you haven't received the PDF file, I think most people should have. If you haven't received that, then go ahead and put your email address into the chat, and we will go ahead and send that to you. But what we're going to do is just take 5 minutes and make sure people are comfortable with using the interface. And so there's let me go ahead and bring up that PDF. I'm reading it out loud, but I have the capability to show it. So we'll take 5 minutes. We'll come back here just a little bit after 10 a.m. And see about, oh, not rendering properly, see about answering some of these questions about what you're seeing in the viewer and whether you have any thoughts on the conservation implications for Mount Sinai Harbor based on these results. So I'll talk to you all after 10. All right, thank you. So I was wondering if anybody wanted to talk about this, the marsh type changes under low, medium, and high sea level rise, and what they see in that. And does anybody have any feedback or response to that question, either through the chat or the microphone? Here I'm animating the low sea level rise scenario. So is there any like interpretation or thoughts about that interpretation? Let me just go ahead and I'll leave we're in sort of like this middle place where if I zoom in, it doesn't quite fit, but if I zoom out, it's a little small. So what I'm seeing in the low sea level rise scenario here, is you have the existing marsh is persisting pretty well. You do have some loss of tidal flats, which are subject to vertical accretion in the model. It's uncertain, but also they don't have that biological feedback or the marshes that are capturing. And there's some nuisance flooding. I go to the on Harbor Beach Road. There's some additional nuisance flooding predicted, as well as the potential for marsh expansion up there. But any marsh expansion up there, I think, is uncertain for a number of reasons. One reason being the fact that it would have to pass over Harbor Beach Road. Another reason being that, in general, I think this is in the interior of a barrier island, but in terms of some of the stuff you have here on the north, the exterior of a barrier island, I think those results are uncertain because it's more likely to be a beach than a marsh, I believe, in those locations. So you can see there's already a lot of beachy land there. But on the other hand, this area in here already has some marsh, and that marsh may expand a little bit. But then also just there's a lot of development. There's a lot of money in this barrier island, and so the fact that that there would be allowing marsh to expand north of that road, I guess uncertain is a good way to put it. So that's what I would see sort of under the lowest sea level rise scenarios. We have this tidal flat issue and this potential issue in the northeast of the study area. So under medium sea level rise, what does anybody want to discuss what they see are under medium sea level rise? So what I'm seeing in the medium sea level rise is this blue color, which exists currently, which is the high marsh, irregularly flooded, is pretty much converted. The vast majority of it is converted to this green color, to a regularly flooded marsh. So there may be some issues, as well as you start to get some marsh loss itself right around the edges that are predicted there. These marsh areas here are pretty much predicted to be lost. And then under high sea level rise, this is one area where I think you have, you're looking at the marsh really being pinched by the elevation of the lands, which is, it's good for all this infrastructure. That's good that has some elevation capital there, but it's not so good for the marsh because like this big marsh area here really has no place to go. It can expand, a few pixels, so that's 10 or 15 meters to the south, but for the most part, it doesn't, because of the elevation of the land, it doesn't really have any place to go. So you have a lot more marsh losses, and the biggest area of marsh expansion again is in this barrier island, which is pretty uncertain. The other question was whether this land is predominantly public or private. So the way I would look at that, I would turn off the overlay, maybe I'll go, actually, maybe I'll go to the current condition of marshes back in 2004. Put on the black and white map just so we're not, and then click on the tax boundaries to see what we're looking at here. And there's a lot of public, it's a mix of public and private. And some of this area is private, but it's Crystal Brook Park Association. So maybe that's closer to public. Private, but community owned in some senses, maybe. And you can click on the individual parcels to see who are the owners: Town of Brookhaven, Village of Port Jefferson. But again, if you look at what's going on here in the upper right, there's a lot of developed land here that's subject to flooding under the high sea level rise scenario, and even under the medium sea level rise. There's a fair amount of flooding that comes into account on all these private parcels that are vertical in configuration. All right, let's go back to the PowerPoint here. I'm going to now hand it off to Marco to talk about some of the details of how the modeling was performed and what underlies it.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I am going to just give a brief overview of a little bit the details that are underneath this map that Jonathan has shown, in particular the probability map, how they are generated and how what kind of uncertainty they consider. So first thing is what kind of data we use as input in our SLAM model. And if you can go to the next slide. So basically we combine several spatial layers that give us several kind of information. The first one is the elevation data, which is the elevation of all the different cells and areas. And these days with LiDAR data, we get a pretty good sense of how the elevation is. And this is very important for determining the flows of the water. And LiDAR are becoming pretty good, and they're cleaned, and you know, over the year I've noticed how things are getting better actually. The other layer that is very important is the wetland layer, which is basically the land covered layer. It's basically differentiating between what is dry land, what is wetland, what is high marsh, what is low marsh. So most of the time we get this information from the National Wetland Inventory, but sometimes localities or other entities have also their own layer, like in New York City, NEIWPCC has developed its own wetland layer. Another aspect another layer that is important is all dikes, impoundment, culverts information that come in, because they all determine where the water might go in the future, depending on where these things are. And so it's another very important piece of information. And the other one, which already Jonathan has shown in many maps, is the impervious layer, which is basically partition the dry land in what is undeveloped and what is developed. And this is important for planning conservation, because one thing is if you have marshes that are predicted to go in a undeveloped area, it's a different story than if, you know, inundation gets in a developed area, because in that case you need to do some kind of restoration that would add cost. So that's an important piece of information also. And the other one that we also use are the data that we use are the erosion rates that basically determine how the coastline will change under erosion condition. And these mostly they come from literature studies, and it's probably the most uncertain, and it's a weakness of the model, as I will point out a little bit later. It's a simple, the way we do erosion is very simple. But so basically we got all these spatial layer, and then as Jonathan has shown initially, basically we divide the landscape in, the landscape is divided in different habitats depending on their elevation with respect of the open water, and if the water can get there based on the tide. And basically, the very important initial work, which we spent most of the time actually when we set up some of these studies, to try to combine all these layers together, spatial layer, the tidal information, and we put them together and we look at what are we getting. Like, are we getting enough water going into areas that are identified as wet, or are we not getting water where the areas are identified as dry land? So we really calibrate the model. So, for example, if we get areas that are identified as dry land, but we're actually getting lots of water because maybe we're missing, our tide range is too high, or maybe we are missing an impoundment or some kind of structure that impedes the water to get there, then we go back, or we ask local people if they know about it, or we look at the map again, and many times we can solve this problem just by looking at the satellite images. And the same way, if you get areas that are marshes and you get water there, maybe it's because you're missing some passages that the LiDAR has not seen, and so everything becomes like a big wall, but actually there is a culvert or a passage of water that we didn't see. Initially, many times was happening that a bridge the LiDAR data of a bridge was actually just looking like a dike, but a bridge, the water goes on. So now these days doesn't happen anymore, but before many times was happening, like a bridge or a road structure that actually is open underneath. So it was acting as a dike. So this is really the big work that we do initially, and we try to calibrate this model, and then basically we project in the future by basically increasing the sea level, and as Jonathan explained, then all the habitats, they move upwards if they can, and the real big component is accretion. I'm not going to spend too much because Jonathan has already explained, but basically the accretion is the capability of the marsh to keep up with sea level rise. So if the rate of sea level rise is small enough, the marsh system and maybe the condition underneath substrate allow the marsh to keep up. So in this example, if the level rise is 2.5 millimeter a year, and the marsh is capable of keep up with 2.5 millimeter a year, basically nothing changed for that marsh, because yes, sea level is increasing, but also the marsh elevation is increasing at the same rate. Now, if the rate starts increasing, the marsh has the capability to respond and accelerate also its accretion, but up to a certain extent. In this case, it's 7 millimeter the maximum accretion rate. So if the sea level rise starts increasing, pushes, try to drown the marsh responds in, but up to a certain point, and then it starts actually drowning because it cannot keep up. Obviously, these data are very uncertain, and here there are data is an example of actually experimental data that have been observed in Long Island, both south, north, and the bays. And these are data from set data that have been collected through the years. Now, more and more, when we talk about marsh conservation, we try to get a better sense of these accretion capabilities to keep up with sea level. And so what we do in the model, we don't really model the mechanism like Jonathan explained before, like the deposits that occur underneath. We are not really modeling that. We just simply try to mimic or build a phenomenology, a curve that basically fit the data, but we don't really know why the data are like that. So we just try to build the curve, and as you can see on the right-hand side, these data are pretty uncertain. There's a wide range of uncertainty. The accretion can vary from 4 to more than 10 millimeters a year. In this case, the 90% the confidence interval. And so when we talk about probability, we basically consider all these uncertainties together. And so you have elevation uncertainty from the LiDAR that is not precise. You have the accretion data that is a wide range of possibilities. Tide range also, it's kind of uncertain, mostly because we don't know how tide ranges will change in the future. So we kind of, since we don't know about these things, we try to consider that also as a source of uncertainty. And then the other one, which is a big component, is the sea level rise. And the sea level rise is, as Jonathan has said, we have certain value, and the viewer shows a certain fixed sea level rise, and this is how the future could be if the sea level rise is that value. But right now we have a quite level of uncertainty, quite degree of uncertainty on sea level rise. And so instead of just looking at what the future might be under 1 meter sea level rise or 50 centimeters, we consider all sorts of different sea level rise. And so basically what we do, we feed the model by considering several combinations of all these input quantities that are uncertain, and we run several predictions under all these different scenarios, and then we try to combine them statistically. So in this case, in this graph, we are showing how the extension of the marsh might change under several scenarios. So all the green line are just one simulation, so with different parameters. So here is, in this case, you get a wide range of possible outcomes in the future, and some they accumulate more on the lower side. But you combine them, all of them, and then you consider like the expected value, the average value, what is your confidence interval, the 90% confidence interval of these prediction. And this kind of give you a sense of not just predicting what it might be, but it's really the likelihood that it might be. And as I just mentioned before, it's the sea level rise is the main driver of our uncertainty. If sea level rise is allowed to change, as we have seen, between 40 centimeters and 2.2, the uncertainty on your prediction is quite more significant. And so the day we get better sense of what this sea level rise would be in 100 years, we can squeeze down the uncertainty of the sea level rise in a more narrow distribution, and then our uncertainty will be narrowed down also with respect of these parameters. But what is important about this is also that when you do prediction or you do simulation, having the sea level rise uncertainty, it kind of give you a sense also where you want to spend your money, in the sense that are you going to try to get a better LiDAR, more quite significantly better, or some other input data quite significant, spending money on getting better sense of what the accretion may be, if it's 10 millimeter or 1 millimeter or 11 millimeter. Probably not until you solve the uncertainty of your sea level rise. So, and this approach is also considering how complicated the model has to be, because you can make a very complicated model, but then if you have this very wide range of uncertainty in your sea level rise, you still have to deal with this uncertainty. And so the model strengths are really a SLAM model. It's really a relatively simple model. It's open source. It's nice because everybody can use it. It doesn't require too many data, as I was saying. You really need just some spatial data and some input parameters. It's easy and relatively cheap to run, because you don't need the special computer power. So you can have a sense of what the future could be just by running a bunch of simulation, but at least you have right away, like with the viewer, a sense of what might be the future. And even if it's simple, as I was saying before, it contains the major processes. Some are simple, but it really describes it really contains all the processes that kind of determine the wetland phase. And so it's a pretty nice tool to inform a policymaker and what the future might be, because it's kind of in a cheap way. You don't have to do too many mental work or some more deeper analysis than having this simulation and try to come up with some kind of expected future conditions. Now, the limitation obviously is the downside. On the other, having it simple had also a drawback. For example, it's not an hydrodynamic model. It doesn't really describe very well the water flows. It's really kind of like a bath model. The sea level rise just increase the level, but how the flows change locally, it's not considered. And this, for local conditions, when you describe local dynamics, can be an issue. But hydrodynamic model is also way more complicated, way more computational demanding. And also, it's not sure if maybe using an hydrodynamic model could be better to describe current condition. We don't know if it's actually giving you a better prediction at the end, provided that you have all this uncertainty around. Another limitation of the model is that there is no mass balance of solids. In the sense that, for example, erosion, we don't really consider where the soil is going. And we know that this can affect the coastline. Part of the coast that is eroded goes back redeposited somewhere else. And we don't have that included in the model. The accretion model would be nice to have it mechanistic, so having a description what are the underlying processes that determine the curve would be maybe better, but at the moment we don't have it as solid as that we could trust. So a fitting model with observed data, it's good enough. And the erosion model, as I mentioned initially, it's very simple. It's just it's very basic in the description of the erosion, and that part could be improved. But I think it's a kind of more getting a sense of what the general future might be than if you want to make prediction of the single coastline on a single sector of the coastline, then probably if you're interested in that, you should use maybe different model, for example, if you're interested in erosion itself. So one of the aspects that we start looking at in the past few years is that we are looking at the marsh, not just when we look at marsh conservation, we're trying to look also at other services that marsh is providing. So initially the idea is that initially marsh conservation would be the more marsh I have, the better it is. And that's the very simple concept, of marsh conservation. Like, let's try to preserve as much more marsh we have, and the more we have, the better it is. But when we consider marsh system, there are also other ecosystem services that are provided. And these might change depending on the stakeholder or the location where the marsh is. And here I'm listing some of the ecosystem benefits that the marsh provides. And one is the wave attenuation. Wave attenuation is, we know that the marsh, having a marsh in front of for a neighborhood, for example, it's important because during a hurricane, it can absorb energy. And that is very important, but it's also important where the marsh is, because if the marsh is in a neighborhood that behind there are people living, it has a value. If the marsh is in the middle of a pond, like for example, the example that Jonathan was showing us, its wave attenuation importance maybe not that significant in that case. Nutrient sequestration, that's as we were discussing a little bit, it's an important ecosystem service that the marsh can provide. And then there are other aspects that are more qualitative, like recreation. The marsh is important also just because of the recreation it provides. And that's not just related to the extension of the match, but it depends on where it is, if it's reachable, if there is parking lot, if there are boardwalks, and that can be very important, especially in cities like in New York City was an important aspect in ecosystem servicing underserved communities that they can reach these match. That is also very important, and so maybe that could give you a value that is beyond just the extension of the marsh. And then you have the more natural habitat preservation that are more a kind of direct, providing for birds and fish and marsh to open water interface. The connectivity of the marsh can be important for habitat preserving. So all these values are also important for stakeholders. And so when we consider the marsh conservation policies, this type of aspect should be also considered. And so the idea here is to really combine what the stakeholder value for the marsh with the SLAM simulation, with the prediction of how the marsh may evolve in the future. And so when you combine these, you come up with certain utility functions that basically give a weight to all these ecosystem services and what really the stakeholder value of this marsh, combined with the prediction of if you're losing the marsh, or if you're gaining area in the future. And so the idea is that you kind of give, instead of just looking at the extension, you look at this value, and then if you have, for example, different parcels you're interested in developing conservation policies or different strategies that you are taking in developing conservation policies, you're actually using these measures to kind of rank and quantify what the benefit may be by doing one strategy rather than another, or buying a certain tax parcel than another. And so one of the important components is really the stakeholder or expert input that give us a sense of these ecosystem values, because some, they could be measured. For example, wave attenuation could be measured if it was possible to measure, the wave action and calculating the wave energy by physical laws. But it could be also just qualitative. Stakeholder, they really give a very great importance to the wave attenuation, and for them that component is important. So basically, we try to answer all of these questions when we look at these stakeholder values. What do you value about this wetland? Or what happens if this wetland becomes half? Or if your wetland is actually get fragmented because it is drowned or it disappeared? And how does it define your utility function? How you define different services? Do you define more recreation than wave attenuation? Or you define more the habitat value? And which of the sites, if you have different sites, or think about the tax parcels, or which one of these provide you more of your utility function than others? And so by answering this, we kind of go from a qualitative aspect that the stakeholder give us to quantify and try to come up with numbers that give us a certain level of relative benefit when we compare all these different tax parcels, for example. And with that, I want to accept any question. One thing that I wanted to mention also for the probability, when we look probably just going back to the probability and the viewer and the fact sheet. So when we look at those maps and you have the probability map, basically these are, as I said, a combination of different sea level rise scenarios. Not only that, but all other uncertainty variables, but the sea level rise is the one that really define the uncertainty. So in the fact sheet, we also summarize the results that be under the worst case scenario, under the very highest sea level rise scenario. So the map gives you a sense of what is the likelihood based on the what we know today. But in the fact sheet, we also give, okay, this is on average what might happen considering the sea level rise range that we have modeled here. But under the worst case scenario, under the highest sea level rise scenario, you might lose this much, and that gives a sense where things, if get really pushed on the right of our sea level rise curve, how things can be get worse. So when you consider conservation, you want to balance that. You don't want to go just for the worst case scenario, but also consider that that could be in the future something in between the average of today and the worst case of tomorrow. You don't have your microphone is off, Jonathan.
Thanks, Marco. Yeah, so if there are any additional questions, feel free to chime in now or put them in the chat. Just going to, Stephen, did you have some question you wanted to ask?
Well, yeah, I think this is a really excellent presentation, particularly going over the pluses and minuses of the reliability or future predictions of the model. I think we all know that we have to come together to globally do something about climate change, and of course that's the impact on future sea level rise. But what can we do now locally to preserve the marshes? I'm not sure I really heard a discussion of that. We have marshes now which are being eroded and being lost through various factors. What is it that we need to do now on a local basis to preserve what we have and perhaps even grow some?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think that's, so again, what we're kind of showing you at this point is we're at the midpoint of the project, and the second half of that project, I think, is trying to pull together groups of state, local, NGO organizations to work together and spend a little bit of time thinking about that. One of the it seems that the modelers who are looking at this are coming to a consensus that sea level rise does not have to be even fairly significant sea level rise does not have to be the end of marshes, but there are some of the biggest issues are with regards to making sure that the pathways exist for marsh transgression so that marshes can effectively move. So I think my answer looking at these marshes in particular is a combination of monitoring current marsh health and seeing if as it potentially goes through transitions, let's say from a high marsh to a low marsh, is subject to more salinity, whether there is extensive erosion that's going on, and whether there can be efforts that can be done to mitigate that. And then, but then also to look at the adjoining parcels, which could potentially have marsh, and make sure that the public lands are managed to allow, there wouldn't be, if this is a public land, there wouldn't be construction of something. This is not a good example, but there wouldn't be construction of something that would where the marshes are predicted to go to, as well as potentially looking at easements on private lands or purchase of private land. So I think that's why we brought the tax parcels into play. But it is an open question. But I do think that there are steps that local governments could take.
Yeah, I just see with sea level rise, most private properties will build and also public properties will build higher dikes and barriers to preserve their property. So,
right. And there is, I think there is on a state by state basis, there are also different regulations about when dikes and seawalls can be built. And so that could be another thing, would be in terms of like advocating for um, a consideration of marsh habitat as part of that process, or limiting the capability for landowners to do that in some cases. That could be another piece of it, would be in terms of generating statewide policy for that. um, any additional questions before I go on?
Can anybody hear me?
Yes.
This is George Martin from the town of Riverhead. One of the concerns that I have is what do we do with the ancient septic systems of all these locations that are so close to sea level at this point? Never mind even what's going to happen with sea level rise.
That is a really important concern, because one of the things that we haven't really discussed is that what we've tried to do in this model to some extent also is model soil saturation, when because we know that the freshwater table also exists in relation to the saltwater table. So as the saltwater rises, the freshwater table here in these coastal areas is going to be pushed up on top of that salt wedge, and it's going to be getting higher. And so it's both going to be challenging existing septic systems, and also making areas for new septic systems. So I do think that's a real significant concern. It's not something that our model covers, that sort of in a really rough estimate of what happens. Sometimes you'll see some expansion. In most cases in New York, the vertical relief of the land means that we're not seeing a lot of expansion of freshwater wetlands, but that is something that there has been some modeling of. So I think that probably for this project, that would be something, when we're looking at our conservation plans and considering planning under sea level rise, that's something that we would identify as a concern that warrants additional study, or that warrants some additional work, because that can obviously have a tremendous number of impacts on um, the value of property, recreation at beaches, and even if you have failing septic systems. That's another piece, as I was saying earlier. A lot of the current marsh loss, or the historical marsh loss, I think is due to degraded water quality, at least based on the literature that we've read. And so if that gets worse due to failing septic systems, then that could also impact the marsh ecosystems themselves. But there are a lot of impacts from that. So I think it's along the lines of something that's not like directly in the scope of what we have studied, but is something that we should, as we're trying to pull this together, something that we should consider a highlight for additional study.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate the questions and the feedback. So I just wanted to briefly touch on let's see, where are we? Mount Sinai Harbor. So let me zoom out a little bit here. I'm going to zoom out far enough, you kind of get things turning back to this red color. But I want to look at some of the areas. We've looked a little bit at the Mattatuck River results. But if we look here, I don't think we've gone into Baiting Hollow yet. But here's another marsh for which we have, system for which we have marsh results for us. I'm just going to look at the high, sort of like the worst case sea level rise scenario on these marshes. And what I'm seeing in this area is these high marshes have a lot of elevation capital. So as they do convert to low marshes, but they're able to hold on even under the worst case scenario through 2100, at least according to its predictions for the most part. There's a little bit of fringiness opening up here, but also a lot of this marsh system is owned by the state of New York. So a lot of the areas where what's going on is owned by there is some definitely again, there's some areas up here to the northwest on the barrier island which are subject to potential for marsh habitat or significant nuisance flooding. So if I put imagery on and take the overlay off, you can see these properties which are subject, which are at some risk. Not really surprisingly, I guess, when you look at the satellite imagery. But the other thing you can do is when you click on the individual parcels, you get information, the same information that was on the fact sheet about the fate of current existing marsh. So there was none on this site. The potential for new marsh. This area, this site only has all of the tax parcels that we put into this viewer were areas where there has some potential for future marsh. So that's kind of where this area here, we didn't highlight these tax parcels because they're not sort of in play. But if I come back over to this here, right, this is 1.7 acres and only potentially a little fringy marsh that can exist on that. And I think that's even higher than the highest. Well, see, it's a little bit of fringe here. So let me come up. I'm going to move to the next site over. There's not a lot of really interesting information about tax parcels on that one. Let's take a look at this one. This one looks a little bit more interesting. So this is Wading River. And you can see there's a lot of marsh at Wading River currently. And a lot of that marsh, so this main parcel here is owned by the Nature Conservancy. But you also have a lot of privately owned marsh. And for some reason, everything is selected. That seems to happen to me periodically. There we go. And so what you can see in these areas, first of all, as an overview of the site, I'll turn off the tax maps first. And you can see that if you look under a worst case scenario, that low marsh is quite vulnerable. That all becomes tidal flats and open water. So a real squeeze there. And that is a combination of factors. The elevation capital of the marsh to begin with, it's already a low marsh, so it doesn't have as far to go. Could be a function of the tide range that is predicted to be in there. Under the medium sea level rise, it's still hanging in. Oh no, I'm sorry. This was high marsh to begin with. I misspoke. But it is converting into a low marsh. So if you put the tax boundaries back on and you kind of go in on these, when you click on an individual parcel, the Nature Conservancy owns this. Well, the Nature Conservancy owns a lot of land here, which is probably beneficial for the marsh habitat. It gives you a sense of where the current marsh is, the likelihood of future marsh, and then it also gives you this marsh ecosystem service value. So with this marsh ecosystem service value, it takes all those pieces that Marco was talking about previously, where we went through, we did all these uncertainty analyses, we surveyed stakeholders and experts about which ecosystem services are most important at which sites, and also the relationship between marsh, the geometric metrics, what the marshes look like in those, and it takes it and puts it into a value from 0 to 100. So this has a lot of marshes in it. And it is predicted to maintain a lot of marshes under most sea level rise scenarios. You can look at the probability map here to get a sense of, there's only a little bit of vulnerability. And so it has a high ecosystem service. And then you can look at its neighbor, which has less marsh. In this case, because they're so similar geographically, it's probably mostly just a function of the size of the marsh. And so this metric here might give you some information about prioritizing sites. That was the design of that. This location here has just a very, very tiny ecosystem service value. So that is a overview of, and Mount Sinai is the site of our next hands-on exercise. So we're going to go through this second page of the hands-on exercises. We're going to just do some comparative examination of 3 sites here to the northeast of the of Mount Sinai Harbor. It says central north, but it's really northeast. And so if you zoom in on this location and you have the tax maps turned on, you can see this kind of a unique triangle here up to the upper right. You click on it. It is Wilmington Savings Fund Society owns it currently. And then we're just going to look at that compared to the two parcels to the north of it. And so I'm just going to give again sort of a 5-minute break for people to look at this, to take a break from the meeting if they need to, try to answer these questions, and then we will cover those. Just to make sure that there's clarity in terms of how to interpret these, and also to talk about some of the finer points of interpreting these results on a parcel by parcel basis. Following that, we're going to start talking about conservation plans. And the first thing we're going to do is Marco is going to touch briefly on some additional data that we have available that's not in this viewer that we can leverage. And then we will talk about what marsh conservation plans might look like and see if there is any feedback from this group, interest in sort of cross-organization collaboration on developing marsh conservation plans in Suffolk County, and hopefully have a conversation. So again, we hope to continue to hear your voice, and I appreciate the feedback that you've given us so far. The one thing I will say before I let this go also is that this modeling, sort of a little bit of a subtle link here, is the modeling project website at the bottom of the legend. If you click on that, this basically brings you back to some raw data and presentations from the NYSERDA land project, which was where we looked very closely at these ecosystem service pieces. So there is a final report. There is a publication in PLOS 1. There's a video abstract if you want to spend 5 minutes and just get an overview of that project, a much longer presentation, and then links to, so there's a lot of information. And again, this is what we were trying to do in this project, was take these pages and pages of information and dozens of minutes of presentations and hundreds of gigabytes of GIS data and simplify that down into something that might be more useful to load. But at the same time, if it's too simple and you want to get a little bit more information about what's behind it or some different maps, there's a lot of resources here. So with that, I'll just take another 5-minute break and we'll be right back. But not a break, an opportunity for you to do your hands-on exercises. Thanks. All right. Well, in the interest of time, I will reconvene now. Um, so these three parcels, um, none of them, if you look at these charts, they currently starts with, let me go back to the current condition here on the map. So none of them have any ecosystem services from marshes to begin with. They all start out with zeros. And if you look under 2100 under medium sea level rise, it looks like there's the central parcel here has the most marshes. If you look under high sea level rise, it might be in the north. It's a little hard to tell from this map. So I guess in a way, it's a little hard to tell what potential ecosystem services could be provided by these three parcels. And I think, I don't know that any of these three parcels are really a target for conservation. This is just just to make sure people understand how the viewer works and how to use the comparative capabilities. If I click on this lower triangle, it says we have a ecosystem service value of 1.39, and at 2100 about a quarter acre of marshes. This one up here is double the ecosystem services and an expected value of about double the amount of marshes, and the one up to the north, again, sort of double on the services and the marshes. Now, part of the reason that I brought this up is because I feel like one of the considerations in terms of the what the model's predicting is that it's not taking into account whether there's development in terms of the ecosystem services. So this is sort of the maximum ecosystem services, assuming that Marsh is allowed to transgress onto these parcels. And so one of the pieces to look at here is the imagery of what currently exists in these three areas. And this area, this triangle here, even though it is listed as impervious, actually doesn't have a house on it. I kind of wandered down there via Google Street Maps. It seems like there was a house that was recently removed. This parcel does have a house, and this parcel seems like it has two houses, and not only that, but two houses with a beach view. And so the values of what's in these locations make it much sort of different in terms of what might be likely to be allowed to occur on these sites. The other piece of this is the fact that when you're looking at areas here to the north of the barrier island, where you're really looking at the open water, it's much less likely, I think, that there's going to be sort of a viable marsh. You can see that there is some potential for marsh habitat occurring here to the north, much more likely due to substrate that is going to be sand. Now, the model does attempt to account for what's going to be beach and what's going to be marshes, but a lot of times it takes the signal of whether you have open ocean and in the sound, this is still determined as estuarine open water. So it assumes that there is a possibility based on the NWI classes that this could be marsh, but it's much more likely to be a beach substrate. These areas which are already contiguous to marsh in the south, I think, are much more likely to have actual marsh associated with them, particularly this triangular shaped lot to the south. So even though this lot here says that it has lower ecosystem service value compared to, say, the northern lot, probably it might have more capability for conservation and actual ecosystem services based on the likelihood of having marshes through the year 2100. Okay, thanks. So Vicky chimed in. I believe the triangle parcel was recently purchased by the town for stormwater capture and water quality protection for the harbor. Well, yeah, that would make some sense because it's interesting going on the street view. As you go different places, they have different dates of imagery. And so one of them has a house and the other one does not have a house. yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that was purchased because it certainly is potentially at it certainly has some potential for risk of nuisance flooding, but also some capability for there to be marsh habitat on it. So again, this is just trying to help give some understand how to read these tables, and then I'll also give some context to interpretation of these ecosystem service values, which are based on the probability maps. And one of the weaknesses of the probability maps that I was has some strengths and weaknesses. Strengths that you do not have to look at this sea level rise tab, and you don't have to like look at a bunch. You can just look at a year and get a sense of it. But one of the weaknesses is that it doesn't take into account whether there's currently development on a site or not, at least as it's currently presented. So are there any questions or comments about the tool, the exercise? You can enter that into the chat or speak, of course. So now, hopefully you're all still at the edge of your seat. It's a lot to ask after 2 hours, but we're getting to the point where we will start to talk about some additional data that can be leveraged for conservation planning, and then hoping to get some conversation about which sites might be relevant to conservation planning, which groups might be willing to work together, and sort of what ecosystem services that you'd be interested in looking at in terms of developing a conservation plan. So as we're discussing this, if people have thoughts, maybe you can organize your thoughts and we can have an open conversation in about 10 or 15 minutes here.
All right. So what I'm going to discuss a little bit really at this point is just show an example and how all the data we have and how you can start looking at these in a practical way to implement certain conservation strategies. And I'm going to discuss some examples we have done in the past, and hopefully it will be clear a little bit better how you combine all this prediction, planning, conservation. So one aspect is that the viewer shows some maps, but the probability map can be of different kinds, and depending on your interest. So Jonathan, if you go on the next one.
Sorry, Marco.
Oh, no problem. And since there are probability map, it depends on what you are interested in. You're maybe focusing just on the existing marsh because that's where your focus of your conservation strategy is. And so you can create map that just look at where the marsh is and what's the probability to be there in the future. Or you can just focus on the new marsh, the one that are able to colonize what is today dry land and migrate on those areas. And you have other map, like if the area is flooded developed, that could be related to infrastructure. It could be related okay. Maybe those areas can be that can accommodate hydraulically some marsh, but in terms of conservation, it's a different problem. So you can focus on those two. And then there are also habitat change, beach, coastal wetland probabilities. And the next one shows an example. For example, habitat change on the left. This is more an idea. It gives a sense on how dynamic that area is. It's not just focusing on wetland, but if it gives you a sense of how much is going to change in terms of landscape, can change, and could change in terms of landscape of habitat change. Or on the right-hand side top is the likelihood of being coastal marsh, and this map can be broken down on the bottom left to just focusing on the new marsh, not just existing, but just the new marsh. And you can see in this case, you have a center area there that could be, because probably has a high probability under all kinds of sea level rise conditions to accommodate some marsh. So that could be an interesting area to look into. And the last map that is also kind of interesting is the likelihood of to convert to open water. So this gives a good idea of if you are trying to conserve marsh, for example, and you have areas that are highly likely to be just become open water in the future, and all kinds of scenarios, maybe the effort of trying to conserve those areas, you maybe want to reconsider because it's going to go underwater anyway, and or the effort to keep it up with the sea level rise could be way more significant. And here it's another example of a new marsh, just zoom in how if you just focus on the new marsh, you say, you know, in 2040, the probability of having a new marsh in some areas that are now dry land are kind of very low, as you can see on the top, kind of blue. As you go, the time proceeds towards 2100, you can see that several more areas become highly likely to accommodate marsh, at least hydraulically. And you know, in terms of conservation, you have to consider maybe some other actions, but increase inundation is quite significant, so that could accommodate marsh on all those areas. And so now you can use this map to start identifying what areas are the one you want to look into and what kind of strategies you want to implement. And so here I'm giving an example where we considered the entire marsh systems, but if you think on the viewer, you can really think about each marsh system as a tax parcel or each tax parcel as a marsh system. And the kind of thought and kind of analysis for all the different strategies could really be broken down by tax parcel. And so here is having a Old Preserve and Garden County Park area in Suffolk County. And we just focus on this marsh system. You can see that today is a high marsh mostly. It's surrounded also by developed areas. And on the right-hand side, we have the worst case scenario of inundation. So under the highest sea level rise scenario, this is the entire area that could get flooded. So if you look back and think what you see in the viewer, this is the footprint of the probability map. So it doesn't really take a difference between what is high probable or low probable. You just look at the footprint of everything that has a certain probability to become inundated. So that gives you an idea of what potentially is in there, but there is no information about probability, but you can see how far the water can go. So the next slide shows when we focus just on the current marsh. And so the current marsh persistent in the future, you can see that in this area in particular, it's not very promising. The likelihood of the marsh to be preserved, like existing marsh be preserved, is very low under all kinds of sea level rise scenarios, except the top fringes that are more interior, because over there the sea level rise needs to really get a little bit higher, so you have a higher probability towards the fringes of the marshes. But the heart of the marsh system is it's based on our simulation and all the sea level rise scenarios, it's pretty low to persist. So what kind of strategy you can implement to preserve this marsh? So one thing is to look at the marsh expansion in undeveloped land. And so here we look at the probability map of the areas that today are undeveloped land and in the future may accommodate marsh. And you can see that there are several areas that have high probability to be marsh in the future, at least again to accommodate marsh. And so imagine if that center area is a tax parcel, you might think, okay, maybe I can buy this or protect this parcel if it's not mine. if it's already public, you might think, okay, let's make sure that these areas stay natural as much as possible in the future. If you look at this map again on the southwest, you can see also that you have some other possibility there is also to go in the undeveloped land, but obviously all these dots that are not considered here are all developed area, houses. So that area actually might accommodate also marsh. Let's see the next slide, where you see all of them. And so you can see that that area where you consider both developed, undeveloped, and existing marsh give the entire picture. And in particular, the area that is southwest may accommodate also marsh, but obviously in terms of implementing conservation is a different story, because you have all the properties and houses, and so in terms of implementing conservation there, it might require maybe more resources, more money, maybe to buy property and take down houses, which most of the time or many times it's a different problem. If you focus on the existing marsh, one of them here we reported because we studied with New York, it's if you just focus on maintaining existing marsh, another strategy is the thin layer deposition, which is basically providing depositing a thin layer of normally dredged material that has been dredged on the bottom of this channel and broadcasted on the existing marsh just to give them elevation to sustain sea level rise. And this has been done and is being tested in several places. And based on our simulation, what we see is that you can get a little bit better resilience in the future, but you are buying some time, which might be enough, but not for the long run. If in the future sea level rise rate increases, thin layer deposition is not gonna solve the problem. You are buying maybe 20 years, which, it could be. Right now, we don't know what to do and we can do this, but it's pretty expensive. So you always have to think about the trade-off there, if you want to spend money in doing this or if that makes sense. And this type of simulation can provide some type of information before, doing this type of studies, so that we have an idea if that could be effective in the future or not. And so then you have all these strategies like, okay, let's try to preserve undeveloped land and allow migration on developed land, or let's look at if we take developed land and restore it to undeveloped so that marsh can migrate on those areas. And obviously these have costs, and they are very different costs. If the land is private, it's public, if you have to restore the developed area. And so here is an example among 6 different marsh systems, but again, it's the same when you break down to marsh parcels, if you want, where we associate the cost of each of these strategies and the benefit per unit cost that they actually provide me. And you can see there is a suite of different possibilities. And depending on the marsh system or the tax parcel, so you can decide which one it fits better your budget. And in this case, you can see as all the different strategies have a different benefit and a different cost. And in particular, for example, in Pelham Bay, the two allow the marsh to migrate either in developed or undeveloped area. You can see how the benefit is so much higher than the per unit cost than the other systems. And the reason is because those areas are public, and being public, they really don't cost you. If you allow marsh to migrate in undeveloped area, they don't cost you anything other than make sure that undeveloped area stays undeveloped. Or for example, in Pelham Bay, there is a big parking lot, and I think New York City Parks is considering to remove or reduce that parking lot to allow marsh migration there. And that also has a cost that is not so much as other because it's already you already own, and the only cost is removing the parking lot out of it. So when you start putting cost and attaching cost to all these tax parts and what either different strategy might entail to be implemented, easement is one strategy that is different than purchasing as a different cost, or not allowing to build seawalls could be another strategy that could be relatively cheap if that becomes the legislator decision. But you have a framework where you basically have the scientific projection and uncertainty included. You have the cost associated to each of these strategies that may you allow to better navigate through all these different possibilities and all these different tax parcels and what to focus on and which tax parcel to focus on first.
Thanks, Marco. So, um, thinking about the project going forward, um, we do plan to leverage the data analysis we've done so far, potentially depending on interest, bring in some of the analyses that Marco showed, including simulations of different adaptation strategies or additional uncertainty analysis maps, and put together some preliminary marsh conservation plans, working over the next 3 to 4 months, and getting that something wrapped up by the end of January. And we'll talk a little bit about what a plan looks like. One thing that we brainstormed about was potentially having some short Zoom working meetings with the team that we produced in November, December, and January, just to talk about the framework, the draft, and make assignments to who wants to work on what section. We do have some additional funding to participate in community workshops. We were hoping to do those in person, but it seems now like very likely that those are going to be done on Zoom. And we can roll these out to a larger group in the community, not just the policymakers. And then we have some time, a couple of months, to incorporate any of the comments and produce sort of a final project presentation. And we've already talked a lot about the project support that we have. We have time to offer for this, so we can do a lot in terms of providing a framework. We talked about all these other pieces, some additional literature analysis, drawing on some of our experience with the literature, and if there are other areas that people are interested in, we can provide that. And so we've been brainstorming over the last couple of weeks about what really is in a marsh conservation plan. And I think some people find it a little bit daunting because they think it has to be somehow it can be as broad or specific as the group wants it to be, and as we have time to put together. Some conservation plans might include something like an engineering model or an engineer's input. We're not talking about that at this time. We're more talking about bringing a group together and reviewing sort of the land conservation goals of the larger group. We've already got some inroads in terms of identifying the marsh resources and characterization of their benefits, and we can further localize those. We have some inroads in terms of assessing threats, sea level rise being one of the most important ones, but there are a number of other issues. Additional development, the building of seawalls, and water quality issues that we can at least we can talk about either qualitatively or quantitatively, depending on the data that we have, and designate some focus areas for action. Potentially, we could incorporate the land ownership or the restoration technique information in there. And finally, just to develop some strategies for outreach or restoration plans, or talk about additional research that's required. So at this point, we wanted to just have some communication with the group. I know we've lost some people because they had to leave a little bit early, but people that are there any stakeholder, obvious sort of groupings of stakeholder groups combined with the marsh complexes that we define through this project, where there will be one of these marsh complexes that in particular calls out to develop a plan with a certain group of people. And so we have specific questions here. So at this point, I'll open it up to people communicating via chat or by speaking about what their thoughts are. Is there any appetite for doing this kind of work? And if so, what would be the focus in terms of both the benefits provided and the sites that we should focus on? And then the other the thing to note is that this is in some of our other calls, people following these meetings have done some reaching out to some other groups that weren't involved and got some information from them. And so we do have some, this doesn't all have to be handled during this meeting, of course, but if you have any interest or you think, well, I don't want to speak for somebody else, but they might be interested, to be able to reach out to us via email and give us any thoughts that you would have in terms of which wetlands you're particularly interested in, or which groups you might think you would want to work with.
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. It was very informative. I'd like to share it with my colleagues, especially on the stewardship side of things at my organization, because we could possibly collaborate on, certain water bodies that we're working on together with partners as well. Just adding it to the repertoire of tools that we have at our disposal.
Thanks. Yeah, the other thing that maybe is that we do when we're talking about like what we have to offer, this contract still has some funds for us to. So I know sometimes when you talk about collaboration, you're looking for teams to go in and on proposals with, but in this case, we do have some funding in place. Now it's not huge and it's not multi-year. It's maybe more of a starting point, but we do in terms of like sort of developing the framework, and it could also be a function of more like working with groups to come up with a framework that could then be filled in over a multi-year effort. Like, what are the important questions? So it could also be to that extent as well. But yeah, thanks. So to answer your question about sharing this, yeah, we have these 4 meetings that we put together. And we do have recordings of them, and we will be making those available once probably trim out a little bit of dead space at the beginning of the meetings, but that's not going to take long. So they should probably be available next week, which would make it easy to hopefully share some of this stuff. Right. So this was kind of a focus. Our focus was on the eastern part of Suffolk, and I don't know if any of these parcels. I guess one of the things to look at, which in some of our other meetings looked at, was to get a sense of maybe in terms of prioritization, which of these sites are given that the majority of our data analysis is with respect to sea level rise, taking a look at which of these areas is the most vulnerable and starting with those as a focus point. And one place to start with that can just be to look at some of these tables on the fact sheets, because you have some really good summaries here for Stony Brook. If we jump to this table, let me zoom in. For Stony Brook, um, your sort of your current marsh area is about 240 acres, and even under the best case scenario where you made all developed and undeveloped land available, you're dropping down to 211 acres. So the existing marsh on public is expected to drop by over half. And so this is an area where the existing marsh habitat is quite, there's a lot of it and it's quite vulnerable. So it might be a place to spend time with, as opposed to another site where there's more resilience. So for example, let's compare that with what we see at Flax Pond. If I click on this fact sheet and jump down here, it goes there's less marsh to begin with, but the potential goes in the opposite direction. Under the best case scenario, it could actually increase. And the currently existing marsh is vulnerable, but not really till the year 2100. By 2055, it's supposed to pretty much hang in there. And by the year 2100, the expected result is to lose about a quarter of it, which could potentially be replaced with management of public lands. So it may be that in terms of choosing these sites, we should look at the relative vulnerability. Would you think that would make sense to try to focus on sites that our model shows have the highest vulnerability? Thanks for your feedback, Josh. We'll definitely be in touch via email. That's kind of the next step, is to we have some meetings that we're setting up with some conservation groups, and we will talk with them and we'll get our thoughts together about the course of the next week, and start to define some sites, some groups. And at that point, we will be reaching back out via email and sort of asking for additional feedback on that, and whether people are interested in joining those groups. When we do get sort of groups put together, you will probably get a single email inviting you, asking you whether you're interested in being part of the process. And we won't continue to email you continuously if that's not in your purview or in your interest. So be sure to, if it is interesting, be sure to reach out and get back to us. I don't really have anything else to say. I will, Vicky, do you have anything else you wanted to say before we close?
No, I think you covered it all. I mean, I think people can take this back and kind of digest it a bit. And it seems like that's what people are doing.
Yes.
And talk to their partners. And if you see, like you said, a vulnerable marsh complex, and the partners in that complex, maybe reach out to them and see, hey, did you attend this webinar? What do you guys think? And we have the list of people, I believe, that attended, from their subset of people we invited. So we know who's definitely interested, and we know people who didn't attend who reached out and said, I want the recordings, and then I'm gonna think about it. So there's definitely a good number of people. But I think, like you said, we'll be in touch and we'll see where we're at next week. And then definitely reach out to us with any questions, or if you have continued interest, or, definitely send an email.
Good, thanks. And I will just close with this very important point that that I noticed yesterday, that the viewer at Mattituck Creek wanted to show us this purple jack-o'-lantern and say Happy Halloween, sort of a data analysis result there. So
says something. Yeah.
That's a good catch.
All right. Well, take care, everybody, and we'll be in touch. And thanks for hanging in there through the presentation. I really appreciate it.